Hi, I'm Yoel Finkelman, curator of the Judaica collection at the National Library of Israel. And I'm super excited about the project that we're all undertaking to catalog Hebrew books from around Italy. And by way of celebrating the cooperation between all of us, I want to show you some of the highlights and some of the treasures from the Italian materials in the Judaica collection of the National Library. I want to start with one of the earliest Hebrew printed books in the world. This is in the first, probably about within 20 years of the beginning of Hebrew printing. We're talking about the city of Soncino in Italy in 1488. And this is one of the first attempts to print a Hebrew Bible. And you might expect that the Hebrew Bible would be the first book that would be printed, but actually printers were a little reluctant to print the Hebrew Bible because of a sense that the technology was not quite yet reliable enough to get it as exact as they wanted it. And printers were concerned that the slightest mistake in the vowel marks or in the cantillation marks or in the spelling of any word could be a terrible catastrophe when printing the Bible, and mistakes of those kinds inevitably crept in. So it took some time before printers were comfortable enough with the technology to work on printing. We're looking at a volume from 1488, printed by the Soncino family, one of the most important Hebrew printing families in history, certainly in the 15th century. And it's a simple Bible in two columns. And we have here the section of the Megillot, Megillat Esther, Megillat Shir HaShirim, as well as several other volumes from the books of the prophets. Not necessarily in the order that we keep them. This was probably rebound in that order. And this copy actually is from the famed Velmadonna collection, the collection of the British collector Jack Lunser, about 80% of which came to the National Library only a few years ago. Another remarkable feature of this book is the cantillation marks and the vowels, which are very complicated in the early days of printing because each letter and each vowel had to be set separately. So printing with vowels just made everything exponentially more complicated, which makes this a real accomplishment in terms of the history of Hebrew printing. The next book that we have, from roughly 1520, is arguably the most important printing experiment in the history of Jewish and Hebrew printing. It's one volume from Daniel Bomberg's first edition of the complete Babylonian Talmud. Daniel Bomberg, who's one of my cultural heroes, a non-Jewish printer who came to Venice and opened a printing shop in which he printed some of the most important books in Hebrew printing, monumental sets of the Bible, of the Talmud, of Maimonides' Code. He was a master at marketing and a master at indexing. He understood that one of the things you could accomplish in print that couldn't be accomplished anywhere else was to have fixed page numbers, was to have fixed indexing tools. So when he published the first complete edition of the Babylonian Talmud, he included page numbers, which to this day are still used. The layout of Bomberg's Babylonian Talmud from 1520 is still the layout that is used today throughout the world for printing the Talmud. And when you reference a text of the Talmud, one might say, as we have here, Tractate Menachot Bet Amud Aleph, Daf Bet Amud Aleph, page 2 or folio 2, side 1, and that's still the way to reference pages of Talmud today. And he printed his Talmud with the text of the Talmud in the middle, the commentaries of Rashi and the Tosafists around, and the layout really has just been fixed since then. Here we have an example of Masechet Menachot, the tractate that deals with grain sacrifices, but is central today because it also includes the laws of tefillin and laws related to the writing of Torah scrolls and other things. We're looking at an extremely beautiful book, but also an extremely tragic book. It's 1550, and Daniel Bomberg himself, who we spoke about earlier, has left the scene, but his students continue to print books in Venice. And one of his important students, Justinian, is is continuing the program of printing monumental collections of important canonical Jewish works. Maharam Padua, a rabbi from Padua, wants to print his commentary on Maimonides' Code. And Justinian does not agree to print it, and so the rabbi goes to a young upstart competitor, Bragadin, who agrees to print the volume. As the printing begins, Justinian, who is extremely upset about the new competition, steals the manuscript and quickly prints a pirate version of Maimonides' Code with the commentaries. This naturally creates an enormous feud between the two printers. Eventually, a cherem, an excommunication, is written by the greatest Ashkenazi rabbi of the day, the Ramah, Rabbi Moses Isserles, in Krakow. Conflict continues, and eventually the two printers turn to the Pope in Rome and to the Inquisition to try to settle the differences. And this has tragic results, because as the Inquisition and the Pope begin looking into rabbinic literature in general, and Maimonides in particular, they become increasingly aware of the heretical material, heretical in their mind, contained in the Talmud and rabbinic literature. And only a few short years later, in 1553, the Talmud is burnt and other Jewish books are burnt just outside the ghetto in Rome. We're looking now at a 1708 edition of a somewhat different book, a book entitled Mishneh Torah, one of the more famous books printed in Italy by a very important Jewish medical doctor named Tobias Cohen, or Tobias Katz, who had studied medicine in Frankfurt, but due to the sense of the stifling anti-Semitic atmosphere, moved to the much more open atmosphere of the University of Padua, where he also studied medicine, the University of Padua essentially being the first European university to open its arms to Jewish students. And there he studied medicine, completing his degree, and realized that he had important messages for his Jewish co-religionists, because the major lessons that he learned about the functioning of the human body, about science as a whole, were things that were available in the Latin language, available in the learned languages of Europe, but not in Jewish languages. And he set out to write a book called Mishneh Torah, a kind of encyclopedia of medical, biological, and scientific knowledge. And it also included in the printed editions several diagrams describing the human body, including the most famous diagram of all, in which he parallels the structure of the human body with that of a tall, multi-story building, as were typical in the ghettos of Italy at the time. As we move into the modern period, print gradually becomes cheaper and more convenient, and it becomes more and more involved not only in scholarly works, but also in the day-to-day passage of information from authorities to citizens and from citizens between themselves. It's even into the 17th and certainly into the 18th century is the beginning of newspapers and periodical printing, as well as numerous wall posters and one-page documents meant to pass along new information to the citizens. Here we're looking at a one-page document, some kind of a poster from 1758, in which the local authorities in Mantova are describing several rules that have come out regarding Jews in the public sphere. And there are two issues at stake in this wall poster, this piece of upcoming legal news. One is a request that the Christian authorities, that the Christian business people, when writing from their banks to Jewish bankers, avoid using the term illustrious as a title of respect toward the Jewish bankers. The second is the language of oaths the Jews will take in courts of law. After all, Jews are not prepared to take the same kinds of oaths as Christians are, and a special stipulation has to be included regarding the kinds of oaths the Jews will take that will be acceptable in the Christian courts, even though they're not willing to take Christian oaths. And the one-page document that is printed only on one side and meant to be posted on a wall or distributed is the kind of way of circulating information very quickly, new and updated information very quickly to the citizens. I know that this project is primarily focused or entirely focused on printed books, but I couldn't quite control myself, and I want to end with cooperation between Spain and Italy on the production of one of the most sumptuous and beautiful manuscripts in the collection of the National Library of Israel. We're talking about a gigantic copy, handwritten in 1350 in Spain, of Maimonides' Code of Jewish Law, the Mishneh Torah, and later carried from Spain roughly 50 years later to Italy, where it was later decorated, or at least the first several tens of pages were decorated in an absolutely stunning style, with designs that are both related to the content of the books, as well as hunting scenes and grotesque faces of various kinds, floral designs in multicolored with gold leaf. And the idea was that even though Maimonides' Code is a study book primarily, it's not a liturgy book, it's not a book that one would normally expect to be beautifully decorated, the sense of decorating a scholarly book, a book of study, is a way of expressing love and veneration for the act of Talmud Torah, of Torah study.